The ink on the divorce decree was barely dry, marking the end of a 10-year marriage and the transfer of the waterfront house, the investment portfolio, and the luxury cars to Elena. She smiled, checking her reflection in the glass of the conference room, completely unaware that the expired business credit card she had scoffed at and tossed back across the mahogany table was not the piece of trash she assumed it to be. In her rush to take everything that glittered, she had ignored the one rusty key that locked away a devastating truth. If you enjoy stories where justice arrives not with a shout, but with the quiet turn of a page, stay with me. The conference room on the 42nd floor of the Rainier Tower smelled of lemon polish and stale aggression. Outside, the Seattle rain blurred the skyline into streaks of gray and charcoal, a fitting backdrop for the end of a decade. Ethan sat with his hands clasped on the mahogany table, his knuckles white. He watched his wife, soon-to-be ex-wife, Elena, as she tapped a manicured fingernail against the stack of documents. She didn't look at him. She was looking at the itemized list of assets, her eyes darting with the predatory precision of a hawk scanning for movement in the grass. The house in Bellevue remains with my client, Elena's lawyer, a man with a suit too shiny for the dreary weather, stated flatly. Along with the furnishings, the 2023 Audi, and the joint savings account at Chase. Ethan felt a kick in his chest, a dull, thumping ache he had grown accustomed to over the last 6 months. Elena, he said, his voice raspy. That house. My grandfather built the framing for the original deck. It's not just an asset. Elena finally looked up. Her face was perfect, composed, the face of a woman who managed public relations for Fortune 500 companies. There was no pity in her eyes, only a weary impatience. It's a $3 million property, Ethan. You can't afford the property taxes on your salary, let alone the upkeep. I'm doing you a favor. A favor, Ethan repeated, the word tasting like ash. We're moving on, her lawyer interrupted, sliding a smaller, thinner file across the table. That leaves the liabilities and the minor holdings, specifically Terra Nova LLC. According to our forensic accountant, this entity has generated zero revenue in 5 years and carries an annual administrative fee of $500, plus potential liability for the unmaintained wetland property in Snohomish. Elena let out a short, derisive laugh. The Swamp Project. I told you 5 years ago that was a money pit, Ethan. You wanted to save the world with sustainable mud huts. It was an architectural experiment, Ethan said quietly. It's a dead anchor, Elena countered, reaching into her designer handbag. She pulled out a wallet, dug through the slots, and flicked a plastic card onto the table. It slid across the polished wood and came to a rest near Ethan's elbow. It was the corporate credit card for Terra Nova. The laminate was peeling slightly at the corner. I don't want it, Elena said, her voice sharp. I don't want the LLC, I don't want the liability, and I certainly don't want to pay half the annual filing fees for a company that does nothing. You keep it. Consider it my concession. Ethan looked at the card. It looked pathetic sitting there against the high-gloss finish of the table, a piece of plastic representing a dream she had convinced him to abandon years ago. If I take the LLC and the full ownership of the Snohomish lot, Ethan said slowly, you waive all future claims to it, regardless of valuation changes? Valuation changes? Elena rolled her eyes, checking her watch. She had a lunch reservation at the Pink Door in 40 minutes. Julian was probably already ordering wine. Ethan, it's a bog. Yes. If you take the debt and that stupid credit card off my hands, I waive everything. Just sign the decree so I can leave." Ethan looked at her one last time. He searched for a trace of the woman who had once sat on the floor of their first apartment, drinking cheap wine and dreaming of the future with him. That woman was gone. In her place was someone who believed that winning meant taking the most expensive things in the room. He reached for his pen. The tip hovered over the signature line. "Fine," Ethan said. "I'll take the company. You keep the house." He signed. The scratch of the pen sounded impossibly loud in the quiet room. Elena snatched her copy the moment he lifted his hand. She stood up, smoothing her skirt, a triumphant smile finally breaking her composure. She had won. She had stripped him of the prime real estate, the cash, and the status. She had left him with a rental apartment and a defunct company. "Take care of yourself, Ethan," she said, already turning toward the door, her heels clicking a sharp rhythm of victory on the hardwood. Ethan sat alone in the conference room as the door clicked shut. He picked up the peeling credit card and turned it over in his hand. The magnetic strip was scratched, but the name on the front was still clear. He slipped it into his pocket, stood up, and walked out into the rain. The radiator in the hallway of the Capitol Hill apartment hissed like a cornered animal, a sharp, metallic sound that did nothing to chase away the damp chill settling into the walls. Ethan set a cardboard box labeled Kitchen Misc onto the laminate counter, wincing as the peeling corner of the countertop caught on his sleeve. It was 8 in the evening. Across the lake in the home he had spent 10 years curating, selecting the slate for the patio, planting the Japanese maples that now framed the driveway. The lights would be on. All of them. Ethan didn't want to check his phone, but the masochistic impulse that accompanies heartbreak is a difficult thing to stifle. He pulled his device from his pocket, the screen glow illuminating the stark emptiness of his new living room. A second-hand sofa, 3 stacks of books, and a view of a brick wall alleyway. He opened Instagram. He didn't have to search. The algorithm, cruel in its efficiency, served it to him immediately. It was a video story. The camera panned across the vaulted ceiling of the Bellevue living room, catching the shimmer of a crystal chandelier. The room was crowded. People were laughing, holding flutes of champagne. Then the camera flipped. Elena's face filled the frame, flushed and radiant, a diamond necklace resting against her collarbone. Julian was behind her, his arm draped casually, possessively over her shoulder. He whispered something in her ear that made her throw her head back and laugh, a sound Ethan knew well, though he hadn't heard it directed at him in years. "Freedom looks good on us," the caption read. New chapter. Finally free. Ethan turned the phone off and tossed it onto the sofa. The silence that rushed back in was heavy. At 42, he was starting over with less than he had at 25. He felt a wave of nausea, not just from the loss, but from the realization of how easily he had been erased. He was a line item that had been deleted from a spreadsheet. He turned back to the box and ripped the tape off. Inside, amidst a jumble of spatulas and coffee mugs, was the thick, black binder for Terra Nova LLC. It had been tossed in there by the movers, an afterthought. Ethan pulled it out. The plastic cover was dusty. He opened it, revealing the incorporation papers from 5 years ago and the single corporate credit card slot. The card was there, blue and gray, looking as obsolete as his marriage. "Useless," he muttered, echoing Elena's words. He walked over to the shredder he had set up by the desk. He turned it on, the machine humming in anticipation. He held the card over the slot. It would be so easy, just let it go. Stop paying the annual registration fee, let the state dissolve the entity, and let the wetlands in Snohomish rot or be seized for back taxes. It was just a reminder of a failure, a sustainable housing dream that never broke ground because Elena had convinced him to take a real job at a corporate firm to pay for the cars she wanted. He lowered the card. The teeth of the shredder grabbed the air inches from the plastic. Then he stopped. It wasn't hope that stopped him. It was a petty, quiet defiance. Elena had thrown this at him like garbage. She had sneered at it. If he destroyed it now, he was just following her orders one last time. No, he thought. I'll keep it. Even if just to remind myself never to listen to her again. He turned the shredder off. The silence returned, but it felt different now. Less empty, more waiting. He tossed the card onto the desk, where it landed with a soft click, catching the reflection of the street lamp outside. Miles away, in the master bedroom of the mansion, Elena slipped away from the party to check her makeup in the ensuite mirror. The noise of the celebration was a dull roar through the heavy oak door. She reapplied her lipstick, inspecting the fine lines around her eyes. Her phone buzzed on the marble vanity. A notification from the bank, mortgage auto draft pending, insufficient funds in primary checking. She frowned, a flicker of annoyance crossing her perfect features. She had moved the settlement cash to a high-yield account that had a 3-day transfer limit. She was asset-rich, but at this exact second, cash poor. Whatever, she whispered, dismissing the notification with a swipe. She would transfer the money tomorrow. She was the winner. Winners didn't worry about auto-pay dates. She smoothed her dress, flashed a practiced smile at her reflection, and turned back toward the party, leaving the phone and the warning behind on the cold stone counter. The rain in Seattle had turned from a drizzle to a relentless, hammering downpour that rattled the single-pane windows of Ethan's apartment. It was Tuesday, a week since the signing. His new routine was a study in grayscale. Wake up, drink instant coffee because his espresso machine was in Bellevue, work remotely on landscape drafts that felt uninspired, and try not to think about the silence. The mail arrived around noon, shoved through the brass slot in the door with a metallic clatter. Mostly flyers for pizza places and internet bundles he couldn't afford. But buried at the bottom was a thick, cream-colored envelope forwarded from his old address. The yellow sticker from the Postal Service marred the front, but the return address was clear. Snohomish County Department of Planning and Development. It was addressed to Terra Nova LLC, Atten. Managing member. Ethan sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. Elena must have tossed it into the forward pile without even looking. Or perhaps she had seen it and assumed it was a fine for the overgrown vegetation on the lot. The property was 5 acres of marshland near a highway off-ramp, a mistake he had bought during a burst of eco-conscious optimism years ago, intending to build sustainable micro-housing. It had never happened. The ground was too soft, the zoning too strict. He nearly tossed the envelope onto the counter to deal with later, but the urgent zoning hearing notice stamp in red ink stopped him. He tore it open. The letter was dense with municipal jargon, citations of codes, subsections, and hearing dates. But one phrase in the second paragraph made him pause, his coffee cup hovering halfway to his mouth. Regarding the proposed rezoning of Sector 4 for the Emerald Corridor Tech Campus Initiative. Ethan frowned. He knew Sector 4. It was industrial wasteland. Why would they put a tech campus there? And why was he being notified? He sat down at his small, wobbly kitchen table and pulled his laptop open. He navigated to the county's planning portal, typing in the parcel number for the Terra Nova land. The map loaded slowly, pixel by pixel. When the overlay appeared, Ethan blinked. The map showed his 5 acres, but the area around it had changed. The gray zones of abandoned warehouses surrounding his plot were now shaded in bright, aggressive blue, labeled Approved Commercial Development. And right through the center of his useless marshland ran a thick red line. Proposed access road and utility easement. His heart gave a strange, erratic thump. He wasn't a real estate tycoon, but he was a landscape architect. He knew how to read a site plan. The developers were building a massive complex, but the geography was landlocked by the highway on one side and the river on the other. The only stable ground for the main access road, the only way in and out for the heavy construction vehicles and the eventual thousands of employees, ran directly through the bedrock spine of his property. He grabbed his phone and dialed the number at the bottom of the letter, the extension for the senior city planner. Planning department, this is Miller. The voice was harried, the sound of phones ringing in the background. Hi, this is Ethan Vance. I'm the owner of Terra Nova LLC. I received a notice about the Emerald Corridor project. The line went silent for a beat. The shuffling of papers stopped. Vance? We've been trying to reach the contact on that title for 3 months. We assumed the LLC was defunct. It's active, Ethan said, his voice steadier than he felt. I'm looking at the map. It looks like you need my land. Mr. Vance, Miller's voice dropped an octave, becoming professional, cautious. The developer, Horizon Group, is finalizing the site acquisitions. They assumed your parcel was a municipal discard. If you hold clear title, well, they can't break ground without that easement. You're the cork in the bottle. Ethan felt a chill that had nothing to do with the drafty apartment. He looked down at the divorce decree, still sitting in a pile of paperwork on the floor. He turned to page 14, the section regarding liabilities and discarded assets. The party of the second part, Elena Vance, hereby irrevocably disclaims any and all interest in the entity known as Terra Nova LLC, citing it as a financial burden, and transfers sole ownership to the party of the first part, Ethan Vance. She had fought over the coffee maker. She had argued for 3 hours about the frequent flyer miles, but she had signed this page without reading the fine print, just to save $500 in transfer fees. Mr. Vance? The planner asked. Are you still there? I'm here, Ethan whispered, his eyes fixed on the red line cutting through his property. I'm listening. The office of Kessler and Associates was nothing like the glass-walled aquarium where Ethan had signed his divorce papers. This office, tucked into a brick building in Pioneer Square, smelled of old paper and strong coffee. It was a place where contracts were dissected, not performed. David Kessler, a man with thick spectacles and a hairline that had retreated in the face of decades of fine print, adjusted his glasses. He had been reading the dissolution agreement for 10 minutes in total silence. Ethan sat across from him, his hands gripping the arms of the chair so hard his fingers ached. Finally, Kessler looked up. He tapped the paragraph on page 14 with a pen. It's aggressive, Kessler said, his voice gravelly. Usually, boilerplate disclaimers are vague, but this is specific. Irrevocably disclaims interest, acknowledges zero value, refuses liability for future encumbrances. He looked at Ethan. She really didn't want to pay the filing fees, did she? She called it a debt anchor, Ethan said. Well, Kessler leaned back, closing the folder with a definitive snap. In her rush to avoid a $500 liability, she legally severed her rights to the equity. If this land is worth what the city planner implied, she has no more claim to it than I do. The corporate veil is intact. and you are the sole member." Ethan let out a breath he felt he had been holding for days. The relief was dizzying. "So if I sell, she can't sue?" "People can always sue, Ethan. Anyone can file a lawsuit," Kessler warned, his eyes narrowing behind the lenses. "But winning? No. She signed it away. However, until the deal with the developers is signed and sealed, I suggest you keep a low profile. Don't give her a reason to look twice at what she threw away." Across the water in Bellevue, the reality of keeping the house was arriving in the form of a service van pulling into the driveway. Elena stood in the kitchen, watching through the window as the technician walked toward the infinity pool. The water, usually a pristine turquoise, was cloudy. "It's the heater and the filtration pump," the technician told her 10 minutes later, wiping grease onto a rag. "Looks like they haven't been serviced in 2 years. Motor burned out." "How much?" Elena asked, crossing her arms against the chill. "Parts and labor. You're looking at about $4,000, maybe $4,500. Elena flinched. She looked back toward the house. Julian was in the living room, ideating on his laptop with his noise-canceling headphones on. He had moved in 3 days ago, bringing with him his expensive Scotch collection and a startup idea that was pre-revenue. He hadn't offered to pay for groceries yet, let alone pool repairs. "Just fix it," Elena said, her voice tight. "Send me the bill." She walked back inside, the silence of the large house pressing in on her. She pulled up her banking app. The settlement money was there. Substantial, yes, but she had already mentally allocated it to a trip to Cabo and a new investment in Julian's app. $4,000 for a pool pump felt like a personal insult. She clicked on her credit card tab. Her personal limit was near maxed out from the Freedom Party expenses. The catering alone had cost more than Ethan used to make in a month. She needed a bridge, just a small float until her bonus came in next month. She scrolled through her digital wallet, deleting old cards. Then she paused. There was one card she hadn't deleted from her autofill settings. It was linked to the old joint business account. She remembered tossing the physical card at Ethan, but the numbers were still saved in her browser. She hesitated. Technically, she had washed her hands of the company, but surely Ethan hadn't closed the account yet. He was too slow, too sentimental to shut things down immediately. And technically, she was still a signatory on the bank records until the final update went through. "It's just a pool pump," she whispered to the empty kitchen. "I earned it. I kept this house standing for 10 years. She didn't click pay yet. She just stared at the saved numbers, justifying the theft as a reimbursement she was owed. Outside, the rain began to fall again, blurring the view of the cloudy pool and the expensive, fragile life she was fighting to maintain. Friday evening arrived with the sort of aggressive glamour that Elena lived for. She and Julian were seated at a window table at Canlis, the city lights shimmering below like scattered diamonds on black velvet. It was the kind of dinner designed to be photographed. Wagyu beef, truffle shavings, and a bottle of Cabernet that cost more than a mortgage payment. Julian was in high spirits, talking animatedly about his disruptive app interface. He looked the part of the tech visionary. Cashmere sweater, perfect stubble, eyes that scanned the room to see who was watching them. "The funding round is practically a done deal," Julian said, swirling his wine. "But until the ink dries, things are a bit tight. Liquid-wise. You understand, right, babe?" Elena smiled, though the muscles in her face felt tight. "Of course, it's just temporary." "Exactly. That's why I love you. You get the big picture." He reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "By the way, I saw that the Four Seasons in Whistler has a suite open for next weekend. I think we deserve a celebration, a pre-funding celebration." He left the sentence hanging there, heavy with expectation. He wasn't asking to go. He was waiting for her to book it. Elena's stomach churned. She had checked her balances in the ladies' room. The pool repair had drained her checking account. The settlement money was still locked in the transfer window. Her personal credit cards were maxed out from redecorating the master bedroom to purge Ethan's memory. I'll take care of it," Elena said, her voice smooth, betraying nothing of the panic rising in her throat. She pulled out her phone under the table. She navigated to the reservation site. $2,500 for the weekend. She selected her primary card. Declined. A flush of heat crept up her neck. She glanced at Julian. He was busy typing on his phone, oblivious, or perhaps willfully ignoring her struggle. If she told him she couldn't pay, the illusion would shatter. He was with her because she was the successful, wealthy executrix, not a divorcee struggling with cash flow. She needed a bridge, just for a few days. Her thumb hovered over the payment options. There, saved in her browser's autofill data from years of booking Ethan's business flights, was the Terra Nova corporate card ending in 4098. The rationalization came swiftly, like a reflex. "I built that company too," she told herself. "I supported him while he played in the dirt. Half of that credit line is morally mine, regardless of what some piece of paper says. Besides, I'll pay it back before the statement even generates. He won't even know." It wasn't theft, she reasoned. It was an advance on the alimony she felt she deserved but hadn't received. She selected the card. She held her breath. Processing. The seconds stretched out, agonizingly slow. Julian laughed at something on his screen. The waiter hovered nearby with the dessert menu. Transaction approved. Elena let out a silent exhale, her shoulders dropping. "Done," she said, flipping her phone over. "Whistler is booked." "You're amazing," Julian beamed, raising his glass. "To us." "To us," Elena echoed, clinking her glass against his. The wine tasted metallic. Across the city, in the dim light of his apartment, Ethan was asleep on the sofa, a book resting on his chest. His phone, charging on the coffee table, lit up the dark room. A single notification banner appeared on the lock screen from the bank app he had reactivated earlier that day. Alert. Card 4098, transaction approved. 2,500 FICORs. Whistler Resort and Spa. The phone buzzed once, a short, sharp vibration against the wood. Ethan didn't wake up. He slept on, unaware that the trap he hadn't even meant to set had just been sprung. The digital paper trail was now indelible. Elena hadn't just spent money. She had pierced the corporate veil, commingling her personal debts with the company she had legally disowned. The rain continued to fall outside, washing away the grime of the city. But inside the server banks of the credit card company, the record was permanent. Monday morning broke with a rare, piercing sunshine that reflected off the wet pavement of Capitol Hill. Inside his small apartment, Ethan sat before his laptop, his coffee forgotten and cold. On the screen was a PDF attachment from the Horizon Group. The subject line was innocuous. Letter of intent re. Parcel 409B. The content was anything but. Dear Mr. Vance, authorization to purchase the entirety of the holdings of Terra Nova LLC for the sum of $85,000, payable upon closing. Ethan read the number again. $18.5 million. He leaned back in his creaky office chair, the springs groaning in the silence. He looked at the other tab open on his browser, his bank statement. The pending charge from Whistler Resort and Spa for $2,540 sat there like a dirty smudge on a masterpiece. He picked up his phone and dialed David Kessler. "She used the card," Ethan said the moment the lawyer answered. "I saw the alert." Kessler's voice was dry, almost amused. "She's pierced the corporate veil. She used company funds for personal leisure after signing a document stating she had no interest in the entity. Ethan, she just handed us the lock and the key." "There's more," Ethan said, staring at the offer letter. "Horizon just sent the formal bid. 18.5. There was a long silence on the other end. "Million? Million." "Stay put," Kessler said, his tone sharpening into battle mode. "Don't answer your phone. Don't answer the door. She's going to find out. And when she does, she's going to come for blood." 200 miles north, in the plush dining room of the Whistler Four Seasons, Elena was slicing into a Benedict. Julian was scrolling through his iPad, looking bored. "Huh," Julian said, pausing mid-scroll. "That's funny. Isn't Vance your ex's last name?" Elena didn't look up. "Yes, why?" "There's a breaking news alert on the Puget Sound Business Journal. Mystery holdout blocking tech campus finally sells. Says the land is owned by a Terra Nova LLC, managed by Ethan Vance." Julian whistled low. "Says the estimated deal value is near 20 million. Did you know he had that kind of equity?" The fork clattered onto Elena's plate. The sound turned heads at the nearby tables. "Let me see that," she snapped, snatching the iPad from his hands. She scanned the article, her eyes widening as they devoured the words. Strategic acquisition, key access point, windfall. The blood drained from her face, leaving her rouge standing out starkly against her pale skin. $20 million. That was their company. She remembered the day they filed the paperwork. She remembered mocking him for the swampland. "He tricked me," she whispered, her voice trembling with a rising fury. "He knew. He sat there in that conference room and let me sign it away because he knew it was a gold mine." "I thought you said he was broke," Julian asked, taking a sip of his mimosa, looking at her with a new, calculating expression. "If he has 20 million, why are you paying for this trip with a credit card?" Elena ignored him. She stood up, her chair scraping violently against the floor. The humiliation of Julian's question was nothing compared to the rage burning in her chest. Ethan had stolen her future. He had let her take the house, the money pit, while he walked away with a winning lottery ticket. "We're leaving," she hissed. "I haven't finished my drink," Julian said. "I said we're leaving," Elena shouted, grabbing her purse. She didn't care about the stairs. She didn't care about the unfinished vacation. She only cared about one thing: getting what was hers. She drove the Porsche back to Seattle at 80 miles an hour, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. She rehearsed the argument in her head. It was marital property. The waiver was signed under duress. He failed to disclose the asset's true value. It's fraud. She believed it. By the time she reached the city limits, she had rewritten history in her mind. She wasn't the woman who had discarded a worthless husband. She was the victim of a grand conspiracy. She pulled up to the curb of the faded brick apartment building in Capitol Hill. It looked run down, pathetic, a perfect hiding spot for a thief. She marched up the steps and pounded on the door of apartment 3B. "Ethan!" she screamed, her voice echoing in the narrow hallway. "Open this door! I know you're in there!" Inside, Ethan sat calmly on his second-hand sofa. He didn't move. He watched the door vibrate with the force of her blows, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel afraid of her anger. He felt only the cold, hard certainty of the law. Ethan unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. Before he could even step back, Elena pushed past him, bringing a gust of cold rain and the scent of expensive tuberose perfume into the stale air of the hallway. She stood in the center of his living room, her chest heaving, her eyes wild as she took in the peeling paint and the cheap furniture. "You knew!" she spat, spinning around to face him. Her voice was trembling, hovering on the edge of a scream. "You sat there in that conference room, playing the victim, playing the sad, discarded husband, while you sat on a $20 million gold mine." Ethan closed the door quietly. The click of the latch was the only sound in the room for a long moment. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't look angry. He just looked tired. "I knew it was a wetland, Elena. I knew it was a possibility. But you didn't care about possibilities. You only cared about what you could sell today." "It's marital property," Elena shouted, throwing her purse onto his sofa. "I built that life with you. I supported your little hobbies. That LLC was founded while we were married. Half of that land is mine. I don't care what that paper says. No judge will uphold a waiver signed under false pretenses." She took a step closer, her face twisting into a sneer. "I'll sue you, Ethan. I'll tie this money up in court for years. I'll make sure you burn through every cent of that $18 million in legal fees before you ever see a dime. Unless you write me a check. Right now." Ethan walked over to the small dining table. He picked up the divorce decree, the heavy document that had defined his life for the last month. Next to it, he placed a single sheet of paper, the printout of the transaction alert from Friday night. "You can sue," Ethan said, his voice level. "You can try to argue that you didn't read the contract you signed. David Kessler tells me it's a weak case, but you might find a lawyer hungry enough to take it." "I will," she threatened, crossing her arms. "But there's a problem," Ethan continued, tapping the second sheet of paper. "See, if you had just walked away, you might have had a moral argument. A poor wife deceived by her husband's story. But you didn't walk away. You got greedy." Elena frowned, her eyes flickering to the paper under his finger. "What are you talking about?" "Friday night," Ethan said. "Whistler, $2,540. Elena's face went slack. The color that had been high in her cheeks vanished. "You used the Terra Nova corporate card," Ethan said, enunciating every word. "The card for the company you irrevocably disclaimed. The company you swore you had no interest in." It was a mistake," she stammered, the fight draining out of her posture. "It was on autofill. I'll pay it back. It's barely $3,000, Ethan. Don't be petty." "It's not about the amount, Elena. It's about the law." Ethan picked up the paper and held it out to her. "It's called piercing the corporate veil. By using company funds for personal luxury after legally separating yourself from the entity, you've committed corporate theft. But more importantly, you've destroyed your own defense." He took a step forward, and for the first time, she took a step back. "You can't claim you were unaware of the company's value while simultaneously treating it like your personal piggy bank," Ethan said. "And since you stole from the company, me, can now go after your personal assets to recover damages. That house in Bellevue? The one you fought so hard for? If you sue me, I will countersue for fraud, and I will take the house to pay for the lawyers." Elena stared at him. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. She hadn't just lost the money. In her arrogance, she had handed him the weapon to destroy what little she had left. "So," Ethan said, placing the paper back on the table. "You have a choice. You can leave now and never contact me again. Or you can stay, and I'll call the police to report credit card fraud. Which one is it going to be?" The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. The rain battered against the window, a relentless drumbeat marking the end of everything she thought she controlled. 6 months later, the spring sun broke over the Cascade Mountains, bathing the Snohomish Valley in a pale golden light. It was a stark contrast to the gray rain that had soaked the city during the divorce proceedings. Ethan stood in his boots on the edge of the wetland. The useless swamp was gone. In its place, survey stakes with orange ribbons marked out the perimeter of the new Emerald Corridor Nature Reserve. He hadn't kept all the money. After taxes and the sale to Horizon Group, he had set aside $5 million to establish a trust for urban green space preservation. A move that had baffled his old colleagues, but brought him a peace he hadn't felt in a decade. He checked his watch. The contractors were arriving in 10 minutes to start the grading for the new public trail system. He wasn't just the landowner anymore. He was the lead landscape architect. His phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a text from David Kessler, his lawyer. "Final audit complete. The IRS is satisfied with the separation of assets. You're clear." Ethan typed a quick "thank you" and slipped the phone back into his pocket. He took a deep breath of the crisp morning air. He didn't feel triumphant. He just felt light. The crushing weight of proving his worth to someone who only valued him on a balance sheet was finally gone. 20 miles west, the silence in the Bellevue mansion was deafening. Elena sat at the granite island in the kitchen. The room was immaculate, cold, and vast. The morning light that hit the high-end appliances offered no warmth. On the counter sat a stack of envelopes. Past due, final notice, service suspension. She didn't open them. She knew what they said. The pool pump incident had been the first domino. When Ethan had threatened the fraud lawsuit, she had been forced to liquidate her remaining jewelry to pay off the credit card company immediately to avoid criminal charges. That drain on her capital had exposed the fragility of her finances. Then Julian had left. It hadn't been a dramatic exit. There were no screaming matches. He had simply gone to a conference in San Francisco 3 weeks ago and never came back. His texts had become sporadic, then stopped altogether. She had seen a photo of him on LinkedIn yesterday, tagged at a vineyard in Napa with a 24-year-old founder of a crypto startup. Elena looked out the window at the infinity pool. The water was a murky, algae-streaked green. She couldn't afford the $4,000 to fix the pump, and she certainly couldn't afford the weekly maintenance crew. The symbol of her victory had turned into a stagnant pond. She stood up and walked to the living room. The furniture she had fought for, the Italian leather sectional, the custom coffee table, looked like stage props in an empty theater. The house was too big. The echo of her own footsteps was a constant reminder of the space she couldn't fill. She walked to the front door and opened it. A real estate agent was standing on the lawn, hammering a wooden post into the perfectly manicured grass. The sign swung back and forth in the gentle breeze. For sale. Price reduced. Elena watched him for a moment. She wrapped her cardigan tighter around herself against the chill. She had won the house, just like she wanted. She had taken everything. And now, to pay for the debts she had accrued trying to keep up appearances, she had to sell it all to strangers. She closed the heavy oak door, shutting out the world. She walked back to the kitchen and saw her reflection in the dark glass of the oven. She looked older, tired. Her hand brushed against her wallet on the counter. Inside, tucked away in a zipper pocket, was the old Terra Nova credit card. She had cut it in half months ago, but she hadn't thrown it away. It was a jagged piece of plastic, sharp and worthless. She picked up the pieces and dropped them into the trash can. They hit the bottom with a hollow thud. It was over.